When someone walks away, pretends they've moved on, or tries to act indifferent, it's easy to get caught up in the noise of appearances. You see the smiles, the outings, the social media updates, and suddenly you're questioning everything. Did I mean nothing? Was I so easy to forget? But here's what many people don't realize. Silence is not absence. Silence is energy in transition. It is not a sign of defeat or weakness. It is the most powerful signal of self-restraint, awareness, and internal shift. When you go silent, when you stop explaining yourself, chasing clarity, or fighting to be understood, you do something extraordinary. You stop feeding the illusion, and when the illusion loses its energy source, the truth begins to emerge. Most people are uncomfortable with silence because silence reveals things they've been avoiding. It's in the absence of noise that real feelings surface. When you're constantly talking, texting, arguing, justifying, you're not allowing space for truth. You're caught in a loop, trying to manage appearances, emotions, and outcomes. But the moment you go quiet, the moment you stop participating in the chaos, you introduce a new vibration into the situation. And that vibration says, I'm not chasing, I'm observing, I'm detaching. That energy is potent, it's felt. It reaches places words cannot. He might pretend to have moved on. He might act like he's healed, indifferent, unaffected. But emotional attachment doesn't die in performance. It dies in silence, because silence strips away the stage. There's no audience, no likes, no comments, no mutual friends to impress. There's just space. And in that space, what's real is exposed. Emotional attachment lingers not in what a person says, but in what a person feels when the external noise is gone. Silence forces a man to sit with himself. And when there's no more arguing, no more validation, no more emotional reaction to cling to, he has to confront his own void. You see, emotional attachment often hides behind patterns. People feed off attention, even if it's negative. They anchor themselves to emotional exchanges like arguments, confusion, jealousy, because those things still connect them to you. As long as you're responding, reacting, hurting, expressing, they know they still hold a piece of you. But when you go silent, that feedback loop is broken. That emotional plug is pulled. Suddenly they're left with the echo of their own behavior. There's nothing to bounce their actions off of, and that's where the truth hits hardest. That's where the detachment starts to do its work. When you shift your energy inward, when you stop giving them access to your voice, your time, your emotions, you're not being cold. You're protecting your frequency. You're taking your power back from where it was being drained. You're no longer running to fix what was never in your control. That silence becomes a mirror. It reflects everything they tried to hide behind performance. And if they were emotionally attached, it will start to show in their confusion, their attempts to provoke you, their subtle check-ins, their indirect presence. Silence isn't about punishment, it's about presence. Your silence speaks volumes. It says you're not desperate, you're not broken, you're not begging. It says you've chosen growth, clarity, and peace over temporary satisfaction. And that kind of energy unsettles people who expected you to fall apart. They don't expect you to rise. They don't expect you to pull back and focus on yourself. Because they've been feeding off your reactions for so long, they've forgotten you have the power to stop giving. When you stop talking, you give yourself room to feel what's real. Your disappointment, your heartbreak, your confusion. You allow yourself to process instead of suppress. And when you do that, you rise above the surface, level games that so many get stuck in. Silence isn't a void, it's a container that holds your healing, your rebuilding, your recentering. It allows you to access deeper layers of self, worth, and identity that aren't based on anyone's treatment of you. Because let's be honest, If someone truly moved on, they wouldn't need to perform. They wouldn't need to make it obvious. Moving on doesn't need an audience. Only unresolved emotions crave attention. Only emotional attachments demand visibility. So when someone's loud about their healing, about how much better they're doing without you, that's not peace, that's performance. And the moment you go silent, that performance starts to falter, because there's no longer a reason to keep it up, unless they're still trying to convince themselves. And that's the beauty of it. Silence doesn't force you to prove anything. It simply allows time and truth to do what they do best, reveal what's real. So while they may pretend, while they may post, while they may project, you stay still. You stay silent, not because you don't care, but because you finally understand that your value doesn't need to be spoken to be known. It needs to be felt, and in your silence it is. People often confuse action with healing, performance with progress. When someone walks away and starts showcasing how happy they are, how they've supposedly moved on, it's easy to believe the show. But behind many of these actions, behind the curated smiles and the loud distractions, there's something deeper at play. Emotional attachment doesn't disappear just because someone pretends it's gone. It hides. It hides behind busyness, behind new relationships, behind forced laughter and exaggerated joy. What you're witnessing is not always a reflection of truth. It's often a performance carefully crafted to mask the unresolved emotions still lingering beneath the surface. Most people don't want to confront their pain. They don't want to sit in silence long enough to feel the ache of what they've lost or the weight of what they truly feel. So instead they perform, they take on roles. They become actors in their own life, playing the part of someone who has let go, when in reality they are carrying the emotional residue of the connection. They try to prove to themselves and to others that they've conquered what still quietly controls them. It's not because they're over you. It's because they haven't figured out how to face the truth without you. Attachment is not something that dies easily. It doesn't dissolve the moment a person decides to walk away. Emotional ties are woven into the subconscious. They live in patterns, habits, memories, triggers. And so when a man acts like he's moved on, it may not be about healing. It might be about hiding. Hiding from the truth that he still feels, still remembers, still reacts internally even if his outside world looks detached. But here's what they can't fake: silence. They can fake movement, they can fake progress, they can even fake peace. But when you stop reacting, when you stop explaining yourself, when you go quiet, it disturbs the illusion. You see, performance needs an audience. It needs someone to notice, someone to believe the story being told. And when you withdraw your energy, when you stop feeding into the narrative, the performance begins to feel empty. That's when the emotional attachment has no place to hide, because there's no validation left, there's no emotional engagement to manipulate, there's no proof that they still have a grip on you. So what happens? The cracks start to show, the exaggerated calmness becomes erratic. The peace starts looking like pressure. The new connections start feeling like cover-ups. It's in the absence of your energy that their unresolved feelings begin to rise to the surface. He may look like he's thriving, but thriving doesn't require proving. Emotional detachment doesn't seek confirmation. If he really moved on, he wouldn't have to show it, he wouldn't have to flaunt it. When something is real, it doesn't need to be broadcasted, but attachment makes people loud. It makes them post more, talk more, date faster, move in haste, not because they've healed, but because they're trying to distract themselves from the part of them that still feels. They're trying to fill a space they said no longer existed. This is why performance is so deceptive, because it's not just meant to convince you, it's meant to convince them, and sometimes they're trying harder to convince themselves than they are trying to convince you. It's a defense mechanism, because if they slow down, if they stop performing, the truth will hit. They still care. They're still attached. They're still emotionally connected, even if they can't admit it. But silence doesn't lie. When you go silent, when you remove yourself from the stage, you make the performance collapse under its own weight. This is why emotional attachment can be seen most clearly not in what someone does, but in how they react to your silence. When you stop texting, calling, or even watching their life, they feel the withdrawal of your energy, and if they weren't emotionally attached, it wouldn't bother them, but it does. That unease, that subtle attempt to get your attention again, that's the emotional tether revealing itself. Because detachment doesn't need confirmation, but attachment craves reaction, the irony is that the more they perform, the more obvious the attachment becomes. True healing is quiet. It's not loud. It doesn't need to announce its arrival. It just is. So when someone is trying so hard to be seen as over it, that desperation to be perceived a certain way often points to the exact opposite. It points to emotion that hasn't been resolved, pain that hasn't been processed, closure that hasn't been earned. When someone is emotionally attached but faking detachment, their energy will contradict their actions, and if you're grounded in awareness, you'll see it, you'll feel it. You'll understand that the louder they are about having moved on, the less they've actually done so. Because people who are truly free don't need to convince anyone. They're too busy living in their peace to put on a show. But people who are still emotionally attached, they hide behind performance, hoping it'll mask the truth their silence cannot deny. When silence enters the space where noise once lived, it doesn't just disappear into the background. It demands attention. Most people are addicted to emotional reactions. They're used to having someone respond, someone react, someone mirror their emotions back to them so they can validate their own importance. But when you go silent, you take away the mirror. You remove the reflection they depended on to gauge their own worth and power. Silence is not just the absence of words. It's the withdrawal of emotional access. And for someone who is emotionally attached, but hiding behind pride, ego, or denial, that withdrawal is loud. It unsettles them. It leaves them wondering. It forces them to sit with feelings they can no longer ignore. When someone pretends to have moved on, a big part of that illusion is sustained by your continued emotional availability. As long as you're reaching out, responding, watching their stories, reacting to their behavior, they feel in control. They feel like they still hold space in your heart. It doesn't matter whether your reaction is anger, confusion, or desperation. Any emotional energy you give them keeps the cord between you alive. But when you remove that cord, when you go silent, detach, and step back, you create an emotional vacuum. And the thing about emotional vacuums is that they pull. They don't push, they create tension. They force the other person to deal with what's been left behind, and this is where the truth begins to leak through their behavior. He may act unaffected, distracted, or better off. But watch what happens when he realizes that your silence isn't a strategy, it's a shift. That's when the discomfort begins, because silence removes the ability to predict your emotions. It strips away the game. It ends the dance, and in that stillness, the person has no option but to feel. Emotional attachment that was once hidden behind ego starts surfacing in odd ways. They may check your online status. They might ask mutual friends about you. They may even post cryptic messages or initiate subtle ways to get your attention again. Not directly, of course, because pride won't allow it. But indirectly, they'll try to poke at your boundaries just to see if you'll respond. This is not random. It's the result of emotional confusion. When someone is emotionally attached but trying to convince themselves that they're not, your silence becomes the test they never expected. They thought you'd chase, you'd call, you'd break the silence first. But you didn't, and that bothers them more than they will ever admit. Because now, they're forced to confront the emotional space you once occupied. And when they find that space empty, when they see you've stopped feeding it, It triggers an inner reckoning they don't know how to handle. Pride is one of the biggest masks people wear when they're emotionally attached. It convinces them to stay quiet even when they want to reach out. It convinces them to pretend they're over it even when their heart still lingers. But pride doesn't survive well in silence. It crumbles under the weight of time. Because time doesn't lie. As the days pass and you remain still, unbothered, unavailable, their emotional defenses begin to weaken. What once felt like power now starts to feel like punishment, and what once felt like control now begins to feel like a mistake. The emotional attachment begins to manifest through small fractures. Maybe they start reminiscing, maybe they play old songs or visit familiar places. They might try to replace you, jump into new distractions, or overcompensate with social appearances. But the one thing they can't do is ignore what's happening internally, and that's the power of your silence. It doesn't demand their attention, it draws it. It's not manipulation, it's a natural law of energy. When you stop giving energy to someone who was used to feeding off your presence, they feel the void, and that void begins to stir emotions they thought they buried. Most people aren't ready to admit when they're still emotionally attached. They fear vulnerability, they fear rejection, they fear losing the image of strength, but silence doesn't ask for permission. It shows up with clarity, and it holds up a mirror to anyone still hiding behind emotional denial. They may not say it, but they feel it. The longer you stay silent, the more the truth grows. It becomes harder to ignore, and even if they never speak it out loud, their behavior will begin to reveal the attachment they tried so hard to mask. You don't need to break the silence to get validation. Their emotional unrest is your confirmation. The way they fumble for control, try to provoke a reaction, or quietly observe your moves without saying a word. That's the language of unresolved connection. It's in the pauses, the silence, the absence of your presence that their feelings rise. And while pride may hold their words hostage, their energy tells a different story, one that says they were never really gone, they just didn't know how to stay. Silence isn't just the absence of communication, it's the confrontation of truth. It reveals what words try to cover up, what smiles try to hide, and what busyness tries to suppress. When a person pretends they've moved on, they rely heavily on noise, constant activity, social interactions, distractions, and external validation. But when you stop responding, when you stop explaining yourself or reacting to their behavior, your silence becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, they are forced to face the very thing they've been avoiding, their own emotional instability. This is why silence is so unsettling to the emotionally attached, because it forces them to sit with themselves. And sitting with oneself, especially when unhealed emotions are involved, is uncomfortable. You see, silence takes away the script. They can't argue with you if you're not speaking. They can't manipulate your feelings if you're not engaging. They can't use their usual tactics. Guilt, charm, anger, pity, if there's no emotional energy to hook into. So they're left alone with their thoughts, and that's where the unraveling begins. The very distractions they used to convince themselves they were over you begin to lose their effect. The high of pretending, of acting, of performing, it wears off quickly, and what's left is the stillness they never wanted to feel. Stillness makes the mind loud. Stillness amplifies the things they buried, and the things they hoped time would erase. That's where emotional instability comes in. It shows up quietly at first. Maybe they start checking your online presence. Maybe they scroll through old photos. Maybe they ask around about you, casually dropping your name in conversations. At this stage, they're still in denial. They want to believe they're just curious, that it's no big deal, but curiosity rooted in unresolved emotions is a sign that something within them hasn't healed. They're drawn to your silence not because they've forgotten, but because they haven't. And the more you hold your silence, the more their mind begins to fill in the blanks with insecurity, assumptions, and regret. Emotional attachment is like a seed that wasn't removed, only covered, and silence strips away the cover. It allows time and space to do their work, exposing what's really growing underneath the surface. Their external calm begins to falter. They may act composed around others, but inside, they're wrestling with questions they can't silence. Why haven't they reached out? Why don't they care anymore? Were they really that strong to let me go without saying a word? These questions trigger the ego, and when the ego is triggered, emotional chaos follows. Not all of it is visible. It doesn't always look like breakdowns or emotional outbursts. Sometimes it looks like sudden mood swings, a shift in behavior, inconsistency in how they present themselves. Because now they're not operating from control. They're reacting to loss. This is the paradox of silence. It feels powerless, but it's one of the most powerful moves you can make when dealing with someone who's emotionally attached yet emotionally unstable. It's not about revenge. It's not about teaching them a lesson. It's about reclaiming your peace and letting them face what they refuse to feel. Because the truth is, as long as you were available, emotionally, mentally, energetically, they never had to confront themselves. You were the distraction from their own healing. But when you remove yourself, you remove their ability to avoid the truth. And that truth begins to echo louder than any words you could have said. Watch closely how they begin to shift. One day they'll seem happy, the next distant. They'll post something that sounds indirect, something that feels like it's meant for you but masked as general. This isn't coincidence, it's conflict, internal conflict. Emotional instability masked in performance, because the person who is truly over you, truly healed, doesn't need your attention to validate their peace, but the one who's still emotionally attached will always struggle in your silence. It's not your absence that hurts them, it's what your absence reveals about them. They begin to second, guess their decisions, they start to regret not valuing your presence when they had it. They may not say it out loud, but internally they're at war. Because emotional attachment mixed with unprocessed pain is like a ticking bomb, it will eventually explode, and it doesn't need your words to trigger it. All it takes is silence. Because silence is a reflection, and when you hold up a mirror to someone who's been avoiding themselves, the truth breaks through the surface. This is why people act out in strange ways after a period of no contact. They might lash out unexpectedly, reach out indirectly, or even try to manipulate you back into speaking. Not because they miss you in a romanticized sense, but because your silence has forced them to feel. And feeling, for someone emotionally unstable, is terrifying. So they try to run back, not always to love, but to comfort, to familiarity, to the emotional cushion you used to provide. But you're no longer there. And that reality becomes the trigger for their unraveling. In many ways, your silence is not just protection, it's revelation. It reveals who's emotionally grounded and who's just pretending to be. It separates those who have genuinely moved forward from those who have simply distracted themselves. The instability you begin to notice in their behavior is not random. It's not a phase. It's the result of emotional imbalance finally exposed by your refusal to feed it. And the longer you stay silent, the more their truth will speak for itself. Emotional dependency is like an invisible thread that binds two people together even when they are physically apart. It's not just about missing someone or longing for their presence. It's about leaning on them for a sense of identity, worth, or emotional regulation. When a person fakes moving on but remains emotionally attached, that dependency still lives inside them. It hides behind the facade of independence and self-assurance, but it surfaces in subtle ways. It shows up in their sudden mood changes, their obsessive thoughts, and their compulsive need to check if you've noticed their absence. They might tell themselves they're doing fine, that they've healed, but deep inside, there's a dependency that refuses to let go, and it often takes silence to reveal just how strong that dependency is. The thing about emotional dependency is that it feeds off attention. Whether that attention is positive or negative doesn't matter. What matters is the emotional supply. So when you withdraw your energy, when you no longer respond, engage, or react, you're removing the very fuel that kept their emotional pattern alive. For someone who is emotionally dependent, this silence feels like starvation. They begin to feel the void that they tried to fill with distractions and temporary relief. The silence forces them to sit with themselves, and in that stillness, the truth becomes undeniable. They weren't strong because they healed. They felt strong because you were still emotionally available, even if indirectly. And now, with your silence standing as a wall, they begin to panic internally. This isn't just sadness or longing. This is the anxiety that arises when someone realizes they were emotionally surviving off someone else's presence. It might manifest in attempts to regain control. They could try to provoke a reaction, reach out with mixed signals, or even start unnecessary drama to see if you still care. Because in their mind, any response from you, even anger, is proof that the emotional tie hasn't been severed. But your silence says otherwise. Your silence signals a boundary they never expected, a strength they underestimated, and a transformation they can't control. Emotional dependency also makes people confuse presence with identity. They believed they were whole because you were around. You were the emotional stabilizer, the listener, the comfort. Even in conflict, you were their emotional home. So when you leave, not just physically but energetically, it shakes their entire sense of stability. They don't just miss you, they miss the version of themselves that existed when they were connected to you. That's the hidden cost of emotional dependency. It makes people forget how to stand on their own 2 feet. They don't realize how deeply attached they've become until silence removes the crutch. This is when the confusion sets in. They start to ask themselves questions like, why can't I stop thinking about them if I've moved on? Or why does their silence affect me this much? They might even attempt to prove to themselves, and others, that they're doing fine, but you'll notice the cracks in their behavior. They might become overly performative, suddenly showcasing happiness, success, or new relationships. But it's all for show, because the one who truly moves on does not feel the need to broadcast it. The loudest person in the room is often the one most uncertain. Silence, on the other hand, comes from clarity and confidence. And that's why it's so unsettling to those who haven't done the inner work. You see, emotional dependency creates illusions. It tricks the dependent person into thinking they're emotionally strong as long as someone else is emotionally available. But when that availability disappears, so does the illusion. They're left facing the emotional gap they never filled, and for the first time they have to acknowledge that their sense of peace was never internal, it was borrowed. Borrowed from your presence, from your energy, from your emotional labor. And when the borrowing ends, so does the illusion of strength. That's when the real emotional spiral begins. They might try to replace you, quickly jumping into new connections, hoping to replicate the emotional comfort they lost. But emotional dependency doesn't switch off just because the person changes. It's not about who you are, it's about what you gave. And what they're seeking isn't another person, it's the same emotional drug, but no one else gives it the way you did. So they keep searching, but the void remains. That's when resentment begins to build, not always toward you, but toward themselves. Because deep down they know they're not truly free, and nothing is more tormenting than pretending to be independent when you're still emotionally tethered. And here's the most powerful truth. Your silence becomes the mirror that shows them that truth. It reflects the areas within them that need healing, the emotional wounds they never addressed, and the inner work they've been avoiding. They begin to realize that dependency was never about love. It was about emotional survival. And now, stripped of that survival tool, they're left with the task of either healing or spiraling. Most will spiral before they heal, because healing requires ownership. It requires admitting that their sense of peace depended on someone else. And that level of truth is difficult to swallow when the ego is still in charge. Your silence isn't just a response, it's a declaration. A declaration that you are no longer the emotional stabilizer, the source of comfort, or the crutch. You've taken your power back, and with that power comes a clarity that confuses the emotionally dependent, because they can't understand how you became so calm, so centered, so unaffected. What they don't see is the internal battle you fought to get to that place. And now, while they struggle with their dependency, you are learning what it means to be emotionally self-sufficient. And in that journey, you break the cycle they are still trapped in. When silence stretches between two people who once shared everything, thoughts, emotions, routines, and vulnerabilities, it becomes more than a gap in conversation. It transforms into a mirror, reflecting back not only the emotional distance, but also the deep truths one might have tried to ignore. And in that mirror, the one faking detachment can no longer hide. Silence holds power because it doesn't lie. Words can be manipulated, gestures can be staged, smiles can be worn like masks, but silence exposes what the heart refuses to admit. When someone pretends to have moved on, they may attempt to convince the world, and even themselves, that they are unaffected. They might flood their days with distractions, surround themselves with noise, even adopt a rehearsed confidence. But silence, the kind that follows your absence, has a way of bringing everything they suppressed to the surface. The human mind is conditioned to seek closure, to create narratives that make sense of separation, loss, or emotional detachment. But when that closure doesn't come from you, when you offer no explanation, no contact, no reaction, their mind has to fill in the blanks. This is where silence begins to take control. The longer it lasts, the more it demands introspection from the person pretending to be over it. And it's in this void, this space free from your influence, that their own emotional chaos begins to rise. It is not your presence that triggers them anymore. It is your absence, and not just the physical absence, but the energetic void. They are left wrestling with unspoken words, unresolved feelings, and the haunting realization that perhaps they were more attached than they ever allowed themselves to admit. This process isn't immediate. At first they may feel empowered by the space, mistaking it for freedom. They tell themselves they are healing. They might even celebrate your silence, convincing themselves they won the emotional game. But silence is not a victory for the emotionally immature. It is a test. It strips away the distractions and exposes emotional patterns. With time, the illusion of detachment begins to wear thin. They begin to feel the weight of their own loneliness, not because they are alone, but because your emotional availability is no longer accessible. And they realize that their sense of validation, confidence, or comfort was never truly internal. It was borrowed from you. Even those who seem the most emotionally distant are not immune. You can spot the ones who are silently unraveling. They overcompensate. They post more, they laugh louder, they become suddenly spiritual or stoic. Not because they've found peace, but because they're trying to prove something, to you, to others, and most of all, to themselves. But silence doesn't need proof, it just is, and in its presence, all performative behavior is eventually exhausted. You cannot out-talk silence, you cannot outperform it. It waits patiently, and in time it reveals the cracks in even the strongest facades. Emotionally, silence is a trigger for reflection. It makes the faking individual confront their dependency, their insecurities, and the fact that they were never as healed as they portrayed. It forces them to ask questions they avoided. Why does their silence hurt? Why am I still thinking about them? Why do I feel incomplete even though I walked away? These questions are uncomfortable, and often they are answered with more silence. But the longer they sit with themselves, the more they realize the truth. Emotional attachment doesn't disappear because the relationship ends. It lingers until it's addressed, and when you're no longer there to carry the emotional burden, they are left to face the weight alone. The silence you give is not meant to punish, it's meant to protect. It's a boundary, a declaration of emotional sovereignty, and while they may try to break it, to draw you back into emotional chaos, the power lies in not responding. Because every unanswered message, every ignored attempt, is a reminder that they no longer have access to the version of you that tolerated emotional dependence. They may try again and again, changing tactics, appearing vulnerable, or even apologetic. But silence requires consistency. It demands that you honor your growth more than their confusion. It's important to understand that silence also acts as a detox for them. The longer they go without emotional stimulation from you, the more their system starts to recalibrate. They begin to feel withdrawal, not because they miss love, but because they miss emotional stimulation. They miss the push and pull, the highs and lows, the drama that disguised itself as passion. And in that withdrawal, they begin to feel what they truly avoided all along, themselves. Silence pulls the curtain back and says, "This is what you're left with when no one else is there to hold your emotional pieces together." For many, that's the moment of awakening, but awakening is not glamorous. It's messy, painful, disorienting, and it often begins with your silence echoing louder than any words you could have spoken. Eventually, some come to terms with what they lost, not just in you, but in themselves. They begin to realize how much of their identity was wrapped up in being seen, validated, or responded to by you. They begin to understand that the version of themselves they thought was strong was actually dependent on your energy. And now that your energy is no longer available, they are faced with rebuilding themselves from the inside out. Some will resist that process. They will blame you, label you cold, heartless, or distant. Not because you are, but because your silence demanded they grow, and growth often feels like abandonment to the emotionally immature. Others, however, will begin to do the work. They'll sit in the discomfort. They'll peel back the layers. They'll stop faking and start facing, because when silence breaks the illusion, only truth remains, and in that truth the healing begins, not because you spoke, but because you chose not to.